In 1897, British soldiers marched into an African city and carried out one of the largest art thefts in human history. They didn't steal gold. They didn't steal land. They stole history. Thousands of priceless African artworks were ripped from royal palaces, shipped to Europe, and sold to museums around the world. Today, many of those artifacts are still on display, labeled as World Heritage. But here's what most people were never told. Those artworks were stolen during a violent invasion, and the civilization they came from was far more advanced than Europe wanted to admit. This is the story of the Benin Empire. And if you watch this video to the end, you'll understand why museums are still fighting to keep what they took. This is one of the most important stories in African history, and one of the most deliberately hidden. So make sure you watch this video all the way through. And if you want real history they didn't teach you in school, subscribe to this channel. Long before Europeans arrived, the Benin Empire was one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in West Africa. It was located in what is now southern Nigeria, and existed for centuries as a centralized kingdom with a clear political system, strict laws, and a highly organized society. This was not a loose collection of villages. This was a true state. The Benin Empire was ruled by the Oba, a sacred king whose authority was both political and spiritual. The Oba was supported by councils of chiefs, court officials, religious leaders, and specialized guilds that controlled trade, art, and administration. Every part of Benin society had structure. Every role had meaning. Every institution served a purpose. Benin City itself shocked early European visitors. The city had wide, straight streets laid out in an organized grid. It had massive earthworks and walls stretching for miles. In fact, the walls of Benin were among the largest man-made structures on Earth at the time, rivaling even parts of the Great Wall of China in scale. The royal palace at the center of the city was enormous, larger than many European palaces. It contained courtyards, ceremonial halls, and living quarters for the Oba, his court, and the artisans who served the kingdom. This was a city designed for governance, ceremony, and power. And at the center of Benin's global importance was art. The artworks known today as the Benin Bronzes were not made for decoration. They were records of history. They documented royal lineages, diplomatic meetings, religious rituals, military victories, and key political events. Each plaque and sculpture was part of a visual archive, a metal history book. These works were produced by highly trained guilds of artists who passed down knowledge through generations. They used advanced casting techniques that required precise control of temperature, metallurgy, and mold creation. This level of craftsmanship did not happen by accident. It required scientific understanding, mathematical planning, and institutional support. Some of the techniques used in Benin bronze casting were equal to or more advanced than techniques used in Europe at the same time. And that created a serious problem for European powers, because Europe had built its colonial narrative on one central lie: that Africa was primitive, that Africans were incapable of advanced governance, technology, or culture, that Africans needed to be ruled. Benin destroyed that narrative completely. European traders and diplomats who visited Benin in the 15th and 16th centuries wrote about a city that was clean, orderly, and impressive. They described disciplined soldiers, strong leadership, a functioning legal system, and thriving trade networks. Benin traded pepper, ivory, cloth, and art with Europeans long before colonization. At one point, Benin controlled so much pepper that Europeans referred to the region as the Pepper Coast. This was not a weak society waiting to be conquered. This was a powerful state choosing how and when to engage with the outside world. But by the late 1800s, the situation had changed. Europe was deep into the scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium were racing to seize territory, resources, and influence. Colonization needed justification, and Benin was standing in the way. The Oba of Benin restricted British trade. He refused to submit to colonial control. He maintained sovereignty. To British officials, this was unacceptable, so they began to look for an excuse. In 1897, Britain launched what it called a punitive expedition. The word punitive suggests justice, but what followed was pure destruction. British forces invaded Benin City with overwhelming firepower. The city was burned. The palace was destroyed. Thousands of people were killed or forced to flee. Benin's political system was dismantled. And then came the looting. British soldiers systematically stripped the royal palace and surrounding buildings. They took bronze heads, plaques, ivory carvings, ceremonial swords, religious objects. Tens of thousands of artifacts were stolen. Not collected, not protected, stolen. The artworks were shipped to Britain. Many were immediately sold to museums and private collectors. The money raised from selling the art was used to pay for the invasion itself. Let that sink in. The destruction of Benin was financed by the theft of its history. Once the bronzes arrived in Europe, museums faced a dilemma. They couldn't admit these objects came from a sophisticated African civilization destroyed by colonial violence. That would expose the lie at the heart of empire. So a new story was created. The bronzes were presented as mysterious. Their origins were questioned. Some scholars suggested Africans could not have made them without foreign help. Others described the works as primitive despite their complexity. This wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate. The same strategy used at Great Zimbabwe was used again. Deny African authorship, minimize African intelligence, rewrite history. For decades, the Benin Bronzes were displayed without context. No mention of invasion, no mention of looting, no mention of mass violence. Just beautiful objects behind glass, as if they appeared there naturally. Today, Benin Bronzes are scattered across the world, in British museums, German museums, American museums, university collections, private homes. Nigeria has requested their return for over a century. For decades, those requests were ignored, dismissed, mocked, but the truth never disappeared. And now the pressure is growing. Activists, scholars, and governments are demanding accountability. Some museums have begun returning pieces, others are still resisting, still negotiating, still delaying. Because returning the bronzes means admitting the truth, that they were stolen, that the invasion was unjustified, and that African history was deliberately erased. This story is not just about art, it's about power. When artifacts are taken, stories are taken with them. When stories are erased, people are easier to control. The Benin Bronzes prove something powerful. Africa did not need Europe to create civilization. Europe needed Africa to forget it. If the Benin Empire was this advanced, if its art was this sophisticated, if its history was deliberately stolen and rewritten, ask yourself this: what else was erased? What other civilizations were buried under lies? And how much of what we call history was written by the people who did the stealing? If this opened your eyes, subscribe to this channel for real history they didn't teach you in school. Like this video so more people see the truth. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. The more people know the truth, the harder it is to erase history.